1989.
Mr Pettersson.
Thank you, Mr Assistant Speaker. I move that this bill be agreed to in principle.
The question is that this bill be agreed to in principle.
Thank you, Mr Assistant Speaker. I rise today to introduce the Drugs of Dependence Personal Use Amendment Bill 2021. This bill will amend the Drugs of Dependence Act 1989 with the effect of decriminalising possession of small amounts of some illicit drugs. Instead of penalising people that use drugs with a criminal conviction, this bill will allow a simple offence notice to be issued, the substance confiscated and the user referred to a medical professional. Mr Assistant Speaker, I believe that it's time for our drug laws to reflect our values. Thanks to the National Drug Strategy Household Survey 2019, we know that the overwhelming majority of Australians want to see people that use drugs given a warning, a fine, or referred to a medical program when caught in possession of small amounts. The community has moved on from the war on drugs, and it's time to move on from criminalisation. We know that the traditional just say no approach hasn't worked. Try as we might, trying to scare people into not using drugs by threatening them with jail hasn't stopped people using drugs. Instead, it's just criminalised and put people in jail. This approach has not and will never neutralise the complex reasons behind why a person chooses to use drugs in the first place. The threat of jail time or a criminal record, put simply, does not deter people from taking drugs. It never has, and it never will. We know that more than 43% of Australians aged over 14 have used what has been considered an illicit drug at some point in their life. Should every one of these people receive a prison sentence or criminal conviction? Of course the answer is no, but our laws say they can and often have. I think a lot of us in this chamber can agree that the historical approach is flawed and is not working as intended. Since the announcement of this bill back in December, I've had many members of the community reach out to me in support. I've heard from people struggling with addiction who are too afraid to reach out for help in fear of criminal justice repercussions. I've met with grieving parents who have lost their children to these substances. I've met with experts and researchers who desperately want to see our laws changed. I've also met with law enforcement and their representatives. United across all of these different groups, they all want to reduce harm. Seemingly, it's a question of how, not if. I've talked with people from all walks of life, and what I've learned is that community values towards drug use are completely different to what they were 30 years ago, when this Assembly became responsible for our drug laws. Even the Education, Employment and Youth Affairs Committee of the previous Assembly has recognised this, and formal recommendation of the report into youth mental health in the ACT was to consider further criminal justice diversion for young drug users by investigating a simple drug offence. That wasn't a majority Labor committee, that was a majority Liberal committee with the now Leader of the Opposition a member. Following that committee report, I moved a motion in the Assembly on the 20th of August 2020, just 2 months before the ACT election, calling on the ACT government to decriminalise the personal possession of small amounts of drugs by investigating a simple drug offence notice. And for the record, this received tripartisan support 2 months before the ACT election. Mr Assistant Speaker, if the experts, the community and legislators on all sides of politics recognise that our drug laws need to be reformed, then now is the time to act. So let's make it happen. Here's a bill to do just that. Now, there are some in the community that have sought to miscategorise what drug law reform is all about. There are some that are saying I'm encouraging drug use. I want to be very clear. Drugs are very dangerous, and I would urge people not to use them for their own well-being and for the community's sake. The quality of these illicit substances varies from batch to batch. More often than not, these illicit drugs are cooked up in terrible circumstances, in bikies' bathtubs with no safety measures or precautions. Drugs can cause lifelong health complications or even cause death. The pill testing trial at the 2019 Groove in the Music Festival uncovered at least 7 pills that contained potentially deadly additives. But we all know this doesn't stop people from using them. If did, we wouldn't be where we are currently. If people choose to consume drugs regardless of the health or legal risks, we as legislators have a responsibility to ensure that where we can, we reduce the harm. After the changes to our cannabis laws in 2019, we've seen how people who do need to seek treatment for their drug use are now able to access that help free of the spectre of the justice system. Since personal possession of cannabis was legalised, according to wastewater analysis, usage has remained the same. Police data shows that drug driving offences have remained steady. ACT health data shows that there's been no increase in cannabis-related hospital visits. At the time, Conservative voices from all over the country criticised this step in the ACT. They said the sky would fall in. And whilst COVID-19 did happen, so they're partly right, it had very little to do with cannabis law reform in the ACT. Well, it's been over a year since cannabis was legalised. We can all see that those worst predictions did not come true. For those Conservative naysayers, I want to be very clear on what these new laws propose and do not propose. Drug driving, trafficking and supply will all still be criminal offences, as they should be. This bill is not about encouraging drug use. This bill aims to give people the support and help that they need, instead of being unnecessarily put through a criminal justice system not designed to provide health care. Most of the time, drug consumers, instead of suppliers, are the ones facing the judicial system. And I think we can all agree that those who traffic and supply drugs should be the ones who face criminal charges, not consumers. People should not be arrested and shamed for their drug use. This can lead to a terrible cycle of recidivism, put simply, a terrible outcome for everyone. Now, I'd like to point out the decriminalisation model presented in this bill is the exact same decriminalisation model that still exists in ACT law for certain users of cannabis. I haven't conjured up a new system here. All I'm saying is that if people thought that system was good enough for decriminalisation before, let's start the conversation there and see where it goes. While I have proposed amendments to our decriminalisation framework for possession, there are other relevant laws that still leave people open to criminal prosecution that have not been included in this drafting. If we can now agree that drug use is a public health issue, offences such as self-administering in the ACT Medicines, Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act need to be reviewed. These charges carry a maximum penalty of $16,000 fine and or a year in prison. This bill doesn't fix the entire problem, but it's a first step in the right direction, and this too should be considered. Whilst I most commonly speak about the health benefits in changing how we treat this issue, there are clear benefits to the justice system too. In the year after cannabis was legalised, cannabis-related offences have decreased by 90%, freeing up police time and resources to tackle the real issues in our community. A simple offence notice system, confiscation and referral to proper treatment options saves court time, legal costs, police time and taxpayer money, and in the end provides a better outcome too. The personal possession limits set out in this legislation have been chosen so as not to coincide with trafficable amounts set out in Commonwealth law. When drafting this bill, I wanted to avoid ambiguity that might result in a person possessing a certain quantity of drugs, which under two different legal frameworks have wildly different consequences. One being a civil offence for possession, the other being a Commonwealth trafficking charge. I acknowledge that the possession limits under Commonwealth and Territory law are wildly different. And it's obvious to, I think, most people who look at Commonwealth thresholds that they're not grounded in lived experience. The current ACT criminal possession thresholds are far more informed of what happens in the real world. I hope in the consideration of this bill we can have a sensible discussion about what these thresholds should be, because I do not think the current thresholds, as I present this bill to you, are perfect. It's simply based on minimising conflict. I think it's also worth acknowledging that the limits in this proposed legislation are based off the weight of the substance, as opposed to a normal consumption unit, like a pill or a tab. I understand that this is not a perfect model, but our current legislation is specified by weight. I think it's worth starting a conversation about these limits, and I note that there is community interest in this too. There are benefits to this framework because it's simpler for people to consume drugs and for police, and acknowledges the reality of people being unaware of the specifics of what they're consuming. I've also heard from members of the community who want to see some of the proposed substances decriminalised and others not. I've also heard from others they want further drugs to be considered for decriminalisation. Ultimately, I think this is a good debate, and one I hope to start by proposing this bill. I think this will be well guided by a committee inquiry and government working with stakeholders. I know that I barely scratched the surface of substances that cause harm in our community. These are some of the most common. I particularly like to draw to the attention of those considering this bill in the committee and government what I would consider the major omission from the list as it stands, that being prescription medications, pharmaceuticals. Opiates are the biggest killer, and they need to be part of this conversation. It is my firm belief that decriminalising drugs is the best way to move forward, and will be best served by discussing what else needs to be included instead of trying to demonise specific drugs. We need to have a holistic response that doesn't discriminate against a person for the drug they consume. A plan that would allow everyone, regardless of the substance, to seek professional help and treatment should they want it is what I aspire to. Whilst I am proposing these changes, I also know that funding for more drug and alcohol services must be enacted alongside this legislation, not in lieu of it. For a comprehensive response to be successful, a well-resourced health and education system is absolutely vital. I believe that the decriminalisation of small quantities of drugs better allows us to treat drug use as a public health problem. This is a common sense step forward that will continue the ACT government's track record of helping those in our community that need help. I encourage all members in this place to engage with this bill. I think Canberra is well served when all members of this place play a part in shaping our legislation through both the committee process and through amendment. Thank you, Mr. Assistant Speaker.